I sat in my car, my gaze fixed intently on her every move. She had just left the house, dressed in a way I had never seen before. I couldn't explain why it unsettled me so much, but something inside me wouldn't let it go. She looked as though she wasn't heading to her usual job. A black dress I had only seen her wear on special occasions. Today, she wore it casually, something she had never done in the morning. Her hair was styled perfectly, and while her face held its usual calm expression, I could see a hint of nervousness. I noticed it immediately. This wasn't her normal morning routine. She walked faster than usual, and I saw her hand tremble slightly as she closed the car door. It seemed like she was hiding something, even though she didn't look in my direction. Something had changed. I felt like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Over the past few weeks, her behavior had become odd. She started staying late at work, became more distant, and her phone was always on silent, even when I was around. I didn't think it was anything serious. Maybe I was just being overly sensitive, but why were her movements so hurried today? Why was she dressed like this? This feeling wouldn't leave me. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it. She got in her car and drove off, and though I could have just gone back inside and told myself this was all in my head, I couldn't. I decided to follow her. Maybe it was wrong, but I had to find out what was going on. My heart started beating faster as I drove after her. It didn't take long for me to decide. I simply had to know where she was going. I couldn't let this go unanswered. Her behavior was so unusual that I had no choice but to follow her and figure out what was really happening. My heart pounded in my chest as I kept a safe distance, tracking her car. Something told me I might learn more than I wanted to. The streets seemed empty, and each step forward felt heavier, as though with every second, I was drawing closer to something I couldn't imagine. And here I was, in my car, following her and tearing myself apart in search of answers. Was this just my imagination? Or had something changed, and I just hadn't noticed it before? I realized I wouldn't stop until I found the truth. I kept my distance, following her through quiet streets, not too close but never letting her out of sight. This wasn't just following, it was a test of my patience, a test of my instincts. Why? Why was she heading to an unfamiliar place? Her routes had been strange lately, and the feeling wouldn't leave me. My heart tightened with anxiety, and my mind screamed that I shouldn't be doing this. But I couldn't stop. I felt there had to be something important I wasn't seeing, and I was determined to find out what. She didn't stop at her office, as usual. No, this time she went to a restaurant, one I had only seen in online ads, but we had never visited. I remembered the name because I couldn't recall us ever discussing this restaurant. She hadn't mentioned she was going there. If it were just a business meeting or a casual dinner with friends, she would have told me. But no, today it felt different. I parked my car in a small lot nearby, leaving enough distance to avoid drawing attention. Everything happening around me now felt surreal. I sat and watched through my car's dirty window. Her car came to a stop, and I saw her get out, again dressed in a way she never would for a normal workday. She seemed different, her movements confident, as if she knew she was heading in the right direction. I didn't know what to do. My nervousness grew with each passing moment as I watched her. She stood near the restaurant door, and suddenly a man came out from inside. He was tall, wearing a dark suit. A stranger. My head filled with questions. Who was he? My mind couldn't associate him with any of her acquaintances I knew. He wasn't someone I recognized. And then they met. They hugged. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was a certain ease in her embrace, a lightness I hadn't seen in a long time. They stood there in that moment as I watched them, seeming so natural, as if this were a regular occurrence for them. It wasn't just a greeting. It was an embrace filled with warmth and emotions that I hadn't felt in our relationship for a long time. Her eyes sparkled, and I saw her laughing, glancing at this man, while I sat there, hidden in my car, feeling my heart tighten with pain. Was he just a friend? Or was it something more? I didn't know, but at this point, it was no longer just a question. It had become a test. Their closeness, the intimacy I saw in their embrace was more than I could have imagined. How was this possible? How had I not noticed this before? My heart beat faster as I realized this wasn't just a casual meeting. It was something I hadn't expected to see. I tried to collect myself, but couldn't. The feeling of unease and disappointment overwhelmed my mind. What if this wasn't just a coincidence? What if I was truly facing a choice that would change my life? They went into the restaurant together, and my thoughts were spinning. I couldn't understand why I was so anxious. Was it just my paranoia, or was there a real reason for my suspicions? I sat, unable to look away, feeling my hands begin to tremble. What next? My thoughts and heart were shattered into pieces. Now I could no longer just sit and watch. I had to find out the truth, no matter how hard it might be. I continued sitting in my car, unable to look away from what was happening in front of me. My wife and the stranger stood by the restaurant door, exchanging the same embrace I had seen earlier. Their movements were so natural that it felt as if I was an outsider, not the husband she was supposed to trust. They entered the restaurant, and I decided to stay in place, unmoving, making no step forward. My head was swarming with questions, but they all seemed to be the same. Who was this man? Why was she spending time with him? Was this just a chance meeting or something more? I watched as they walked through the glass doors of the restaurant, and I began to feel that something significant was changing. I sat there in silence, not knowing what to do. As I tried to calm myself, keeping my eyes fixed on the door, I felt my heart tighten in my chest. All of this felt like a terrible dream. My wife, the woman I thought was mine, was now here, at a restaurant with someone I didn't even know. But what surprised me even more was what happened inside. I leaned closer to the window, pressing my cheek against the cold glass to get a better view. They were seated at a table, and I could hear their voices through the closed window. At first, their conversation was quiet, almost intimate. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but every laugh, every subtle movement of her body, it felt like a stab to my heart. She laughed in a way she hadn't laughed with me in a long time. Her voice sounded natural, relaxed, and I could see her face light up with joy. How had this happened? How had I not noticed it before? Why was she opening up to this man and not to me? I felt as though I had been thrown into a sea of emotions, where everything I knew about our relationship suddenly disappeared. They sat together, their conversations growing louder, and I could hear him laughing in response to her jokes. Their energy was different. This wasn't ordinary communication. They seemed to merge, like two old friends who hadn't seen each other in years and were now savoring every moment together. And then I realized this was more than just a meeting. This wasn't a casual dinner or a business meeting. This was something much deeper. I continued watching until my hands began to tremble with nerves. I saw them transition from one topic to another, and their glances exchanged a connection I hadn't received from her in a long time. This was chemistry, not just a conversation, but something more, something vivid, alive, and real. It was as if I had become a stranger in their world, a world where I was no longer needed. But even then, as I understood that my presence didn't matter, something inside me wouldn't let it go. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My wife, the person I loved and shared my life with, was sitting next to a stranger, freely exchanging emotions and laughter, casually spending time as if she had always been with him. I couldn't understand what was happening. My mind was full of thoughts, and I no longer knew if I even knew her anymore. But then, one moment changed everything. She leaned toward him, and their faces came so close that I saw her gently touch his hand. A wave of anger and pain swept through me, something I couldn't control. My wife, the woman I had planned a future with, was now choosing to spend time with this stranger as if nothing had ever existed between us. That was the moment I realized I couldn't just sit there and watch. I had to find out who he was and what was happening between them. My soul was on the edge, and I didn't know if I could forgive this. I sat in the car, unable to take my eyes off the restaurant, from which they didn't step out even for a moment. They were still at the table, his hands lightly holding hers, her face glowing with laughter, and I felt every beat of my heart echo in my chest, as if a million shards were tearing me apart from within. I didn't know how much time had passed, and it only made it worse. I sat there like a zombie, watching these two, unable to stop the thoughts swirling in my head. How had this happened? What was between them? I was no longer sure of what I was seeing. Every gesture, every laugh, every word that didn't reach my ears but echoed loudly in my heart made me feel like something irreparable was happening to my world. Could I just sit there, watching as my wife, whom I once loved, sat with another man, laughing with him as we used to laugh together? This couldn't be normal. My nervousness grew with each passing second. I couldn't leave it unanswered. There was no doubt left in my mind. This wasn't just a friendly meeting. This was something more. I felt it with every cell in my body, and when I suddenly realized that I could no longer just sit and watch, I resolutely stepped out of the car. My legs trembled, and my heart pounded so hard I couldn't even focus on the steps I was taking. I moved toward the restaurant, and with each step closer, my emotions grew stronger. All my thoughts were tangled in countless questions, but one worried me the most. Who was this man? What was between them? And why hadn't I noticed this before? Now I stood at the restaurant door and felt each step grow heavier. I couldn't even tell if I was ready to learn the whole truth. When I touched the door handle, a wave of emotions flooded over me again. I stopped for a moment, feeling my hand freeze in place. Had I gone too far? What if I learned something I couldn't bear? But there was no answer to that question, because fear and anger overwhelmed me, and I could no longer turn back. I felt as though my heart was about to explode from the tension. My hands were cold, but my legs, despite the anxiety, moved automatically, leading me forward. I opened the door, and the sound of the bell was like a jolt to my consciousness. As close as I was to them, I felt equally distant from myself. My eyes quickly scanned the restaurant. Elegant tables, soft lighting, but most of all, I was searching for them. Searching for her. And there she was, sitting across from him, their gazes seemingly fused into one, and all I felt was a deep rupture between us. My legs felt like they were tangled, but I couldn't stop. All my doubts vanished. I approached their table. The closer I got, the more I felt time stretching. They looked at me, and I couldn't gather my thoughts. My lips trembled, but no words came out. This was the moment when everything changed. I stood before them, and all that was left was one question. Why? They looked at me with expressions of surprise, but I couldn't stop. I felt that this was more than just a question. It was a decision. Perhaps it no longer concerned them, but only me. I lifted my head and took a deep breath. Now I had to find out what was really happening between them. There was no turning back. I stood before them. My hand still held the restaurant door handle, but I no longer felt its weight. All I saw was right in front of me. She and he were sitting at the table, enjoying their conversation, completely calm. They looked as if there were no barriers between them, as if I didn't exist. And although my legs carried me toward them, I felt that each step was heavy, as if it were the last thing I could do in my life. Her gaze met mine, and I saw her eyes, so familiar, so close, yet so distant. She didn't look surprised. Her face showed neither embarrassment nor guilt. It was as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't crossed any boundaries. She simply sat there, smiling at him, and then turned her gaze to me as if I were no longer part of her world. In that look, it was everything. I felt my chest tighten, and every word I might have said became impossible. The stranger lifted his head when he saw me. His expression was so detached, as if he couldn't even imagine who I was. I looked at him, trying to understand if he knew who I was, or if he was just another person who had wandered into her life, like I once had. I approached their table, and with every step, whether I wanted it or not, my emotions grew stronger. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I felt I had to say something. I was now standing beside them, and in that moment, feeling the cold air against my skin, I asked, "What's going on?" My wife nervously glanced at him, then at me, and her lips trembled slightly. Her expression changed. She was surprised, but more than that, I could feel her guilt. She swallowed a few times, but no words came out. The stranger looked at me, his gaze filled with confusion, as if he couldn't quite understand why I was standing there. His eyes showed no trace of guilt, just the bewilderment of someone who had never expected to meet the person whose world he had just shattered. She remained silent, and I could see her gaze on me shifting. That was the moment I realized she was trying to hide the truth. She started fidgeting, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to pick up a glass of water, but quickly set it back down. "Why are you following me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of defensiveness and fear, as if she were trying to deflect attention from the undeniable. Her words hit me like a blow, and I felt the pain of disappointment turning into searing anger. How could she ask me that? How could she twist the situation to make it seem like I was the one doing something wrong? She was trying to change the subject, to avoid answering, but I saw how her eyes darkened, how she struggled to maintain control over her emotions. My fingers clenched into fists, and I felt my mind starting to slip out of control. "How can you ask me that?" I replied, trying to keep my voice from sounding too sharp. "What is happening here with him?" I gestured toward the stranger, and his expression shifted. Now he began to feel the tension, realizing his secret was about to be exposed. She closed her eyes for a moment, then looked at me again, but this time her gaze was no longer calm. She trembled, like someone carrying a heavy burden. "You don't understand," she said, as if searching for the right words to explain everything. "It's not what you think. There's nothing between us." Her voice grew weak, but the words still felt like a blow. I already knew that answer wouldn't satisfy me, but for some reason, I still wanted to hear it from her, some fragment of truth. I stood before them, and all these moments, everything I had built and trusted, began to weigh on me like an enormous stone. I looked at her, at him, and my heart tightened with disappointment. She didn't confess, didn't apologize, didn't try to explain. She just changed the subject, became more distant, as if trying to escape reality. My anxiety turned into terrible clarity. Everything I was seeing here wasn't a coincidence. This was what had been happening behind my back. It was more than just physical infidelity. It was a deep betrayal of trust. Her reaction confirmed everything I had feared to learn. I couldn't hold it inside any longer. "I understand," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But my heart, pounding as if it were breaking my chest, wouldn't let me rest. My eyes met hers one last time, and I saw that even she now realized that nothing could justify what had happened. And I understood one thing. There was nothing left to fix. I stood before her, my heart breaking from everything I had just seen. This man, sitting there as if nothing had happened, and my wife, the one I had shared my life with, sitting next to him, smiling, talking as if there had never been anything between us. I couldn't bear the silence any longer, and I gathered all my strength to ask the question. "What does this all mean? Why now? Why him? Why did you do this?" She stood before me, nervously glancing at the table, her hands trembling. She avoided my gaze, as if searching for the right words to say. I could see her struggling to find an answer, one I didn't want to hear. And then, when she finally lifted her head, I saw it. Not just fear, but a deep sense of disappointment and loneliness in her eyes. It was as if she had surrendered her defenses. And then she began to speak. I didn't know who to talk to, she started, her voice quiet, each word carrying immense weight. We've become so distant, and I couldn't understand why. You stopped paying attention to me. At first, I thought it was just temporary, that you were just tired, but it went on for so long. You stopped noticing me. I felt like I was just part of your routine. She paused, and I felt her words pierce me like a sharp dagger. Was it true? Had I really failed to notice what was happening between us? I couldn't stop her words, and they cut deeper than any betrayal could. How had I not seen that she felt this lonely? I started to feel like you weren't really there anymore, like you didn't want to be with me, she continued, her face full of pain. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't any longer. You were physically there, but your mind was somewhere far away. And then I met him. She gestured toward the man sitting at the table, who looked as though this was the most natural place for him to be. He glanced at me again, and now I could see that his eyes lacked the innocence I had hoped to find. He became my friend, she said, turning back to me. Her words sounded bitter, as if they carried an undeniable truth. At first, we just talked about small things. I didn't expect it to mean so much to me, but with every passing day, I felt like my soul was filling up when I was with him. He listened to me, and not just listened. He understood me. He saw me for who I was, and in him, I found what I so desperately lacked from you. She lingered on my face, as if trying to read my reaction, to see if I would believe her. I didn't know what to say. It wasn't easy to accept. She continued speaking, trying to explain. I didn't go looking for this. I didn't want this. But he became my support. I felt so lonely in our home for so long. And with each day that you grew more distant, I realized more and more that it wasn't just your attention I was missing, but a real connection. You became a stranger, and he was there. He became my friend, and he was there when I needed it most. We didn't do anything more. I promise I wasn't trying to pursue this. But what I felt became so important to me that I couldn't hide it any longer. I sat there, deaf to everything else around me. It was such a simple truth, yet it was terrifying. She hadn't just betrayed me physically. She had betrayed me emotionally, giving a part of herself to someone who was willing to listen and understand when I couldn't be that person for her. Was this my fault? Or was it her choice to seek elsewhere what I couldn't provide? I just want you to understand, she said, trying to hold my gaze. I didn't want this to happen. I don't know what to do now, but I have to be honest with you. I felt the pain inside me grow. I no longer knew what it was, disappointment, anger, or even sympathy. All these emotions intertwined, and I couldn't separate them. Could I forgive her? Did I have the strength to let this all go and move forward? I stood before her, not believing my eyes, and every word she said echoed in my head like a haunting refrain. My wife, my partner, now stood before me, telling me everything I didn't want to hear. She hadn't just been with him, hadn't just sought comfort from a stranger. She was revealing to me that perhaps I had been part of her despair. How had I not noticed that she was so lonely? How had I failed to see that she truly needed me, while I had been pulling away, focused only on myself? My fingers began to tremble. I felt the anger and disappointment swirling inside me, like a storm cloud darkening my thoughts. How could she do this to me? How had I not seen it? She, my wife, the woman I shared the best moments of my life with, now stood here, admitting that she had sought someone else because I hadn't given her what she so desperately needed: my attention, my support. My soul ached, and every word she spoke struck me like a heavy blow. How could this have happened? I couldn't find an answer. She had chosen someone else. She had turned to him when I wasn't there, when I hadn't noticed her needs. It was hard for me to deal with these thoughts. It was hard to pull myself together when every surge of emotion threatened to explode. But then, Amid the pain and anger, I suddenly realized she hadn't just betrayed me. She had suffered too. Her loneliness, her need for support that I had failed to see, had pushed her down this path. My indifference to her feelings had become something she could no longer hide. I began to reflect on the moment when everything changed, when I started pulling away from her, when my attention was consumed by work, by other responsibilities, while she remained in the background. Had I been too focused on myself? Had I missed what was happening right beside me? Had I made her into someone I didn't recognize? My thoughts swirled chaotically, tearing me apart from within. On one hand, I was filled with rage, feeling utterly betrayed, as her embrace with another person was something I could never imagine. It shattered my feelings, and I didn't know if I was ready to forgive. But on the other hand, I began to understand that she, too, had been searching for answers on her own path, and perhaps I had been the one preventing her from finding them. She was lonely, and I didn't see it. I didn't hear, didn't feel her emotions, didn't notice her feelings until she turned to someone else for help. As painful as it was, I began to realize that it wasn't just her fault. I was guilty too. I should have been there for her, not withdrawing, not leaving her alone in a world where she was desperately trying to find support. All these questions swirled in my head, making me feel like I was standing on the edge of something monumental. It was more than just betrayal. It was our lost opportunity. I stood before her, and she was there, more vulnerable and honest than ever, yet just as confused as I was. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave it all behind? Could we go back to what we once had? I thought about it. I tried to find an answer, but it remained as elusive as it had been just moments ago. I couldn't ignore what I felt, but was I ready to forget everything that had happened? I looked at her and at him, at her despairing expression and his bewildered reaction, and suddenly I felt like a stranger in my own life. That was the moment I realized I was facing a choice I hadn't planned for. It wasn't just anger that consumed me, but also a deep desire to find a way back, to understand her, to understand myself. And ultimately, could what was broken ever be repaired, or was it already beyond hope? Now, it wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about us, our relationship, our ability to rebuild trust, our future. I stood before her, feeling the air between us grow heavy and opaque. Every second, every glance from her, every breath I took felt infinite. Everything I wanted to say, everything I felt, was teetering on the brink of either explosion or complete oblivion. My emotions were a storm tearing me apart from the inside. But what next? What now? She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. It was a mix of guilt, fear, and hope. She didn't know what to expect from me. She was silent, and that silence was worse than any word she could have said. And I couldn't take it anymore. I knew that if I gave in to my emotions now, it would destroy everything for good. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. Every instinct screamed, "End it all. Walk away. Don't give her another chance." But at the same time, I felt that I wasn't ready for that step. It was too much. I stood on the edge, but couldn't take the plunge. Was I ready to give up everything we had built together over this one moment? Could I believe that this was the end? Or was this the point where we could start anew? I think we need to talk at home, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But even I could hear the tremble in it. I saw her shoulders sag slightly as if she had expected a bigger reaction, but didn't get it. Her lips quivered slightly as though she wanted to say something, but only managed a nod. I glanced at the man sitting beside her. He looked confused, as if he didn't know whether to speak or remain silent. His presence was awkward, but I chose not to focus on him. This was a conversation between her and me. He was merely a spectator, a stranger in this drama I never asked for. "I'm sorry for following you," I said, and those words didn't come easily. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but rather an attempt to maintain control over the situation. But I couldn't just sit at home when I felt something was wrong. She nodded again, her eyes now softer, almost grateful. She didn't say anything, and I didn't want to hear more at that moment. I needed time to figure out what all of this meant. Time to think about whether I could accept her explanation, whether I could rebuild trust. This wasn't a decision to leave forever, but it was a decision to give myself space. I turned and walked toward the exit. Every step felt heavy, as though my legs weighed a ton. When I stepped outside, the cool night wind brushed against my face, and I felt my lungs fill with fresh air for the first time that evening. I stood there, looking at the faint stars overhead, and felt my anxiety ease just a bit. But the pain remained. It sat deep in my chest, and I knew it would be a long night. I got into my car, unsure of where to go. Go home? The place I had always considered my refuge now felt foreign. Could I return there and look her in the eye, knowing everything had changed? But I knew I needed time to make a decision. And while I wasn't ready for a dramatic break, I also didn't know if I could put everything back the way it was. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. The night had been sleepless. Every thought about what I had seen and heard turned into an endless stream of doubts and questions. She was still asleep when I got ready for work. Her face was peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But I knew everything had changed. And while I tried to convince myself to leave it all behind, the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I drove to work, listening to music that usually calmed me, but even my favorite song sounded hollow this time. My mind was consumed with just one thought. What do I do next? Could I forget this and move on? Could I forgive? But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Something was still hidden, something waiting ahead of me. At work, I tried to focus on my tasks, but it was impossible. Every second reminded me of last night, and every minute felt like an eternity. And then it happened. My phone vibrated, and I glanced at the screen. A message from the stranger. I froze. My heart began to race, and my hands trembled as I opened the text. What does he want to say? Why is he texting me after everything that happened? 1,000 questions swirled in my head, but I wasn't ready for what I was about to read. I know you found out everything, the message began. My eyes skimmed over the screen, but each word felt like a dagger to my heart. I need to tell you the truth. My relationship with her isn't just friendly. I know what you're thinking, and it's hard to explain, but I started talking to her because she felt lonely. She was disappointed in your marriage, and I just wanted to support her. But it went beyond friendship. She told me you didn't notice her, and I began to feel something more for her. My heart stopped for a moment. His words sounded like a verdict I didn't want to hear. This was no longer just her confessions or my suspicions. It was the truth standing before me, undeniable and cruel. He admitted that their relationship was more than just friendship. And while he tried to explain that it started with good intentions, I couldn't accept it. I read the message over and over, unable to believe my eyes. He added, I know this will ruin everything between you, but I can't stay silent anymore. You deserve to know the truth. I don't want to be the reason for your problems, but I feel I have to be honest. I sat in my office, holding my phone, as the world around me ceased to exist. My thoughts were chaotic. What did he mean? Did this mean she cheated on me? Or was this just his way of justifying himself? I had no answers, but this message changed everything. I could no longer ignore what was happening. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. How was I supposed to react? What should I do next? This man had just confirmed what I feared, but his confession also left many questions. Was this the whole truth? Was there more I didn't know? And would she have told me herself if he hadn't done it? I felt my anger and frustration rising within me again. But at the same time, there was another feeling, a sense that this wasn't the end. that this was only part of a bigger picture that was still hidden from me. I knew I needed to act now, but how? Was I ready for what I might discover next? I sat in my office, staring at my phone. That stranger had already told me more than I was ready to hear, but now I was left alone with my thoughts. What now? Was everything as he said? Could this be manipulation, an attempt to justify himself? But deep down, I felt the truth wasn't fully revealed yet. This man had shattered everything I thought I knew, but I felt this was just the tip of the iceberg. My phone vibrated again, and I immediately glanced at the screen. It was a message from her. My wife. My heart tightened. What would she say? Would it be an excuse? A confession of guilt? I didn't know what to expect, but deep down, I felt it would be something important. I opened the message, and with every word I read, my hands began to tremble. "We need to talk," the message began, but then it continued with something I couldn't imagine. "What you learned isn't the whole truth. I know you talked to him, and I understand how it looks, but there's something you don't know." I held my breath and kept reading. "This man, he's not just a stranger. He's my ex-husband." These words, like thunder in a clear sky, pierced me through. I reread them to make sure I understood correctly. Her ex-husband? How is that possible? Why had she never mentioned him? How could she keep this a secret from me for so many years? I felt my breath catch in my throat. The message continued. "I didn't plan to meet him. It happened by chance. We crossed paths a few months ago, and it stirred up so many emotions in me. I didn't know how to tell you. At first, it was just a conversation, but then we started talking more. I didn't know what to do. He was such an important part of my past, and I felt those feelings returning." Every word she wrote felt like a knife twisting in my heart. She not only hid this from me, but allowed those old feelings to control her. Did this mean she still loved him? Did this mean I was just a replacement? My thoughts spiraled, and I couldn't stop them. "I know how it looks," she continued, "and I know you'll never forgive me for this. But I want you to understand, this wasn't about me not loving you. It was about me. I struggled with my emotions, and I didn't know how to stop it. You are my present, my future, but he was my past, and I don't know how to reconcile these parts of myself." I felt my head spin. She betrayed me not just with her actions, but by hiding this part of her life from me. Her words were filled with confusion and pain, but I couldn't find the strength to sympathize with her. I just sat there, feeling my world collapse around me. The message ended with, "I'm sorry I complicated everything. I know I've lost your trust, but I also know I can't live with this lie anymore. That's the whole truth. What you decide now is up to you." I put down the phone and stared at the wall. All these words, all these confessions changed everything. This wasn't just a simple betrayal anymore. This was a part of her life she never shared with me, and now it had exploded like a bomb, destroying the remnants of our shared world. My heart was shattered. Could I ever forgive her? Was there a future for us after this? And most importantly, was this the end, or just the beginning of a new, painful journey?